Hello, Sarah Sabin, executive and team coach here in the Leading in the Modern Way video interview series. And I am thrilled to have with me here today Pete Sena, who is a serial entrepreneur and business builder. Pete, welcome to the show. And could you briefly introduce yourself to my listeners?
Absolutely. Well, as always, Sarah, thank you so much for having me on the show. Love what you're doing. And just to answer your question. So my name's Pete. We all know that at this point. I have been building businesses for 20 plus years. My superpower is brand strategy and creativity specifically. So I've worn a lot of hats over the years. Started out as a coder and was building software, and then moved into design and marketing. I just really loved how user experience and product could make people essentially think and act differently. And then from there, I went on to build a brand consultancy called Digital Surgeons, which I started in my dorm room and built that up into a national firm. And now I spend most of my time advising, angel investing, and just helping people hopefully not make the million mistakes that I made throughout the years building my business.
And thank you for that introduction. I'm going to go straight in there because you've referred to the million mistakes you've made. And I'm not expecting you to go through all 1 million of them, but
that could take a while, Sarah.
We only have 20 minutes today. Could you perhaps highlight some of the key mistakes that you've made and some of the learnings that you've taken from those that you really want to impress upon other entrepreneurs, how they can avoid some of those mistakes?
Yeah. So the first mistake is thinking that you have to know it all and do it all to succeed. And if you're the one that's doing all the work, you're not an entrepreneur, you're a solopreneur. And being a solopreneur is great. I know a lot of friends of mine that do very well and they're very happy and being a solopreneur. But if you're looking to build a business, it's a lot easier to go further, faster when you're not the only person doing it. So I'd say the first lesson that I learned early I learned this lesson too late, is that when you're trying to do it all by yourself, that's not scalable. And you're going to either burn out or not achieve your hopes and dreams that way. That's, I'd say, one lesson that I made a lot of mistake in. My background is, as I mentioned, it's in software and design. So I love the craft that goes into building software and design. And when you're building a business and when you're the CEO and the founder, at some point you have to let go of the things that you love to do and bring people in to do those things, because the job of the CEO is not to be the head of product, the lead coder, the head of finance. The job of the CEO is to sort of be the conductor of the orchestra and not playing every instrument in the chair. So that's, I'd say, the first lesson. Should I move on to the second lesson and speed round it, or do you want to kind of unpack that a little bit further?
No, let's do 3 mistakes and then dig down into them.
Cool. So I'd say, first mistake we just covered is trying to do it all yourself. Mm-hmm. Second mistake is blindly trusting. And I'll unpack that for a second. So I didn't realize it. It's a pretty shameful thing to talk about, but I love vulnerability, hence the Brene Brown book behind me. And I was building a really high growth business. My co-founder and I were doing amazing things, working with some of the leading brands in the world. And we had a distrustful employee, a CFO specifically, that robbed us of a lot of money, and we were completely ignorant to it. So what I would say is being careful to blindly trust. I believe that everyone should start from a clean slate, but I think that the heart and guts of a business are the financials and your people, and you need to pay really close attention to both of those. And had I done that, the finance part, I always pay close attention to my people, but had I done the finance part, I probably would have caught that earlier and could have saved me a great deal of pain and a great deal of turmoil that came from that. So that's the second big mistake, is don't blindly trust. The third big mistake, I think, is as practitioners, we often are really adept to our craft, whether our craft is, in your case, leadership coaching and consulting, whether your craft is design, development, whatever your craft is, legal, finance, whatever world you come from. As practitioners, when we grow into becoming leaders and scaling companies, we often think about the how. And I'd say the third lesson for me is don't think about the how, focus on the why and the who. So what is the purpose that you're trying to achieve? What's that big vision? And then who can help you bring that vision to life? When I focus too much on the how, I found myself getting into doing the thinking and doing the task versus just setting the vision, finding the right people to be in the seat to be able to help bring that to life. And that was a lesson that took me about 20 years to learn. It's when you hire someone smart, let them do their job. So avoid the micromanagement, avoid the getting in the weeds in the how, focus on outcomes, not outputs and inputs. And that would be, I'd say, how to round that up into 3 quick, simple lessons, I guess.
I love that. And I think I'm going to deal with the first and third one first because they're interconnected.
Great.
So you can't do everything yourself.
Yeah.
But what you are there to do as the founder and CEO of a business is to set the vision and then hire the right people. And that's the people part of it. And then get out of the way.
Yes. Yeah. I would say that the core job of a CEO in a startup environment is set the vision, support and grow the culture, and make sure you don't run out of money. And then the job, wherever possible, is get out of the way. And when you find obstacles or ties that need to be broken, whether it's a decision that needs to be made that folks might be languishing on or whatever, help to break those ties and always strive to keep what I call the delta. And delta is a core value of mine, which is like, how do we keep change and progress happening at all moments? And that's something I really focus on is like, look for stagnation in the business, look for friction in the business, do whatever you can to keep that moving, but really empower the leaders that you have, empower the teams that you have to bring the magic and the vision to life.
Yeah. And I want to then tie that into the second point. And that is sort of being careful about who you trust, right? So in this case, had you been more aware of the finances, you would have been able to spot it sooner, probably. So there is, in my opinion, a line to be walked here. And that looks like you get out of people's way, but you have enough knowledge of the core functions of the business and how that works in order to be able to ask the right questions and in order to hold people accountable to the outcomes that you have set for the business.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important line to walk because that will stop you getting into blind trust where you accept as gospel truth everything that everyone says all the time.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about here is what we as leaders refer to as accountability, right? So I think that being able to understand the accountability frame, being able to understand the measurements and the instruments of measurement in your business and let you lean into and focus on those things. So when I say don't blindly trust, what I more so mean is making sure that there's an accountability frame for thinking, actions, and the resulting outcomes that come from that. And I think that, in my case, just to be, very vulnerable, I was looking at P&Ls, I was looking at all of the instruments of the business, but I wasn't looking at the bank statements because the bank statements are physical things. At that time, they were coming in and we didn't have all the fancy tools that we have today to sort of do these things, right? Tools like Ramp and, all these advanced financial instruments. Back then, we're just dealing with, basic things. So I think that when I say don't blindly trust, what I mean specifically is like, make agreements, understand what people say they're going to do, and hold people to those agreements. And that I think would create a level of transparency and feedback loops that would help to institute success. And, the example I give is I like to think about my business as traffic lights. So we have a series of traffic lights that I've instituted in my business and all my businesses. I've started and supported many. And traffic lights are great because it's red, yellow, green, right? We know if we see a red light and we blow the red light, there's a high possibility that we're going to get smashed into or smashed into somebody else, right? So I think creating constraints can really unlock creativity, can be a catalyst for success. And I think having those instruments of measurement would have allowed for those mistakes to not happen. So at the end of the day, I hold myself accountable for those mistakes because I don't want to play a victim. I think what happened to me and our business, which we've now recovered significantly stronger from, this is years ago, right? It was a lesson, and it was a very expensive lesson. And I think businesses met with lots of lessons, but rather than sort of crying the woe me, for me, it's what can I learn from that? What will I never do again because that happened? What can I learn? What systems can I put in place? What measurements can I put in place? What screening can I put in place to ensure that that doesn't happen again? And it might happen again. That's the reality of life, right? Is like we are dealing with an ever evolving, complex set of systems in any businesses that we're dealing with today. And, you know, in the future, it's going to be less about people and more about these AIs and making sure that these AIs don't go, you know, off the rails and do what they're not supposed to.
Yeah, I just want to draw attention to something you mentioned, which is building the structures that support creativity. And people might think of creativity as this whole chaotic process, and thinking of a mad professor with surrounded by chaos, and that's their creative process. But that by itself doesn't work within a company framework unless you build the structures to support it. So innovation exists within a structured container. Otherwise, it's just a load of ideas buzzing around with no real rhyme or reason. But when you institute that structure, you have a container that it happens in. And then you have a structure that determines which of those ideas go through to the next stage.
I would agree with you in principle, but disagree with you in tactic. So a good example is I've worked with a lot of creative mad scientists, you know, women and men that are uniquely gifted in their own ways. The term we use today, we didn't have a term for it 20 years ago. The term we use today is neurodivergent, right? I work with a lot of neurodivergent people. I'm neurodivergent myself. I have ADHD. So for me, a whiteboard is like a place of solace, right? So I could disappear for 24 hours and not eat and just be drinking caffeine and sort of on a whiteboard, like you'd see in the Beautiful Mind movie or that sort of thing, writing crazy things and kind of going off. That whiteboard can be a constraint. The constraint can be when you fill the whiteboard, you come up for air. The constraint can be after 12 hours or 6 hours, check in with your manager, your leader, or your team. So I think in some cases, some people mistake systems for stale processes that I think suck the fun out of it. For me, I'm in the business of applying creativity and curiosity to everything I do, right? I believe that that's the catalyst for success. So for me, creative people in different industries work very differently. Some people want, you know, the constraint of a tight brief that can hold them, you know, in a specific frame. Some people want deadline-based things, spatial-based things, guardrails, if you will. I think guardrails are really helpful. It's kind of like when you're going bowling, right? It's like if you're just starting to learn how to bowl, having those little guardrails so that it doesn't sort of go in the pocket is helpful to have. But at some point, taking those guardrails or those training wheels off are really important. So I like to focus on workflow. I like to focus on work outcome, not output. And I'm really big into systems, but I also want to make sure that process is only as good as the process that you follow. And I think in a lot of cases, what I see is people will just be like, okay, it's time to scale now. We're 100 people. We're, you know, 50 million in revenue. It's time to really scale. And then the thing that got them there, which ultimately won't get them to the next place, is that ensemble of characters. But now when they want to turn up the juice, they want to add process, and they do it. They go from 0 to 1. So they go from a world with no process to extreme amounts of process. And then really talented people are like, you've now put me in such a small tight box. I don't want to be here. So I think it's important when we think about our systems to understand that systems are there to support people to add and remove friction from parts of the journey and then create more reliable, consistent outcomes. But when we're dealing with creativity and innovation, we have to be really careful with the amount of process that we inject, because if not done right, it can really, really spoil creativity. It can spoil the culture. My favorite example is if you look at children. If you give children a problem to solve and they're working together in a shared environment, if you give them constraints, they will absolutely be able to succeed. But if you give them step-by-step instructions on what to do, in some cases, you'll get a lesser creative output at the end of that. So I think that in many ways, that same metaphor I would give of inspiring children, we know that play is how people learn. We know that play is how people discover and innovate. Sometimes I see organizations have just too much process that kind of sucks the play out of things. So didn't mean to go off on a tangent there, but I'm just very passionate about the topic.
No, thank you. I have taken that to mean that play is important within a process as well. So it's not one thing or another. It's not like purely process driven, no play. And it's not play where there's absolute chaos reigning. The best results are a marriage of the two and experimenting with what that looks like.
Yeah. And I think I would build on something there and say chaos, I think I think that some of the greatest work I've done has been in controlled chaos, right? Which is create just enough constraint where it's not completely blind chaos, but not too much where it spoils the improvisational process of creativity. So yeah, I think we're on the same page there.
So moving on to the topic of leading people, how do you personally define strong leadership?
Now that's a great question. I would say strong leadership starts from a place of knowing thyself. I think that strong leaders are emotionally intelligent because they recognize that their job is to clearly communicate and lead. And by lead, I mean lead to a specific outcome, whatever that outcome might be, achieving a vision, achieving a business result, a KPI. So I think it starts from self internally. I think there's a lot of leadership approaches that I really strongly agree with, right? Like servant leadership, I really agree with. Conscious leadership, I really agree with. Leadership, like anything else, I think of leadership a lot like music, right? It can be very subjective, but there are some elements of music that we can agree on. And I think there's some elements of leadership we can agree on. So I think that, clarity is important. I think trust and psychological safety are important. I think nurturing in an environment of creativity and curiosity are really important. And most importantly, when I think about leadership, it's coming from a place of high EQ and trust, I think is really, really important. Is that when you have people who trust one another, who understand what they're here to do, it allows for the next part of leadership, which I think is really important. And this is the part that I was really bad at for a long time, is accountability. I'm a team player. So a lot of times in my career, when people that I liked that had done great things for the organization, when they were drifting for whatever reason, maybe it was personal reasons, maybe it was professional reasons, maybe it was the challenge in front of them, not holding people accountable, I think is a very great way to not just poison your company and poison your culture, but also to poison the person. Because I think in some cases you're doing them a disservice if you're leading them and you're not holding them accountable. So I would say accountability is a really important part of leadership as well. But leadership is one of those things where you could ask 100 great leaders what makes a great leader. And I think that you're going to get different words and different messages. But I think what they'd all probably agree with is that a high level of EQ and communication capabilities and trust capabilities would probably be things that would come up. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, interestingly, the point about you ask 100 different people that question, you get 100 different answers. I have indeed tested that theory, and yes, different things come up from those that are very profit driven, profit focused, very operational, very functional, and less people focused, to those that are very visionary in nature, but not very good at the execution part, but they'll talk about a lot about vision, to those that are very people-centric and will talk a lot about the things that you've highlighted just there. So I think, you know, there are different archetypes of leaders, and we tend to fall more into some of those archetypes than others. What I have noticed, though, is that, you know, if you are not people-centric, then you don't necessarily focus on that as much as you should. So you probably wouldn't be saying, oh, emotional intelligence is super important. You probably wouldn't be saying that you actually spending time with your team is important, mentoring your team, all of that. So I think it depends on the type of leader. But for me personally, and I'm very open about sharing, when I was a startup founder, I was not people-centric. So I very much worked on the development of emotional intelligence skills over time, because I saw the positive impact of doing that, rather than being very operational, functional, task-driven, etc. And I think that's a point I want to highlight. If you feel like emotional intelligence isn't your zone of genius, it is something that you can work on and is very much worth working on.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And when I think about my career, I achieved the most, the fastest, with the highest amount of like hyper growth, as a lot of the Silicon Valley folks talk about, when I was ruthless with getting things done, where you were either on board making it happen or you weren't here, right? So like people talk about like hire slow, fire fast. Like when people talk about like just like ruthless growth, I think there was a time in my career a long time ago where that was the kind of leader I was. It was like, look, you're either like getting better every single day or you don't belong here, kind of thing. And while I don't think I was ever like a full-on asshole, I'm sure some people would say I was, but I don't think I wasn't cruel. I was always firm. And I think there was times where I pushed people too hard. And I think that a lot of leaders do that. But that was when I was experiencing like the hyper growth. The thing that I think is interesting to note is like you have hyper growth. And in a lot of cases, if you grow too fast, it's kind of like cancer, right? And what I mean, like literally like the actual cancer is like overgrowth of a cell, right? It's like there's a delicate balance between growth, lots of growth, a little bit of growth, and then hyper growth. And then at some point when there's too much growth, there are consequences of that. And I used like a biological term in terms of, by mentioning cancer, I wasn't trying to be caustic, but rather saying like, you can have too much growth too fast. And I think what I've come to realize when I look at like the greatest, most intelligent design of companies is nature, right? And biomimicry, if you will. So when I look at that, intelligent design to me is about understanding what you have in front of you and what you're trying to achieve. And now what I realize is that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And I've learned that from just hiring really great leaders that have helped me realize, sure, we can grow 70% in the next quarter, but here's what's going to happen if we do that, right? Here's what the culture is going to look like for the next 2 years if we do that, versus why don't we focus on growing 20% in this particular time period, whatever, really creating good self-care for our people and that sort of thing. So I think it depends on the goal and the outcome. And, if I was trying to build I have a couple of different businesses, but let's say I was starting one right now that was, focused on building the next AI widget, just to use an example, right? If I wanted to build something and exit it in the next 24 months, I would go into it and letting people know we're going to work absolutely unhealthy for the next 24 months because all of us want to become multimillionaires and take this thing to IPO. And this is what we're chasing. That's, I think, what drives the hustle culture that can let those results happen. But if you mislead people and say, okay, you're going to join this organization, we believe in these different things, we believe in balance, and then you don't do what you're going to say, that's where I think that people feel misled. So I think in a lot of cases, you can be what I just discussed. You can say like, we're going to be the kind of company that works, 6 days a week and 70 hours a week. If people believe in that and they understand that, then you've given them that constraint. I don't believe that that's healthy, right? I believe, what I've learned over the years is that people need self-care. They need time for their family. They need autonomy. They need an ability to achieve mastery. They need a deeper sense of why and purpose. And if you give people that, people stick around longer. Your attrition is lower. You're able to develop more sustainable cultures, more sustainable growth organisms versus just having like a breakthrough quarter or a breakthrough year. So for me, I like to look at the past data and the people who have succeeded and failed for me to inform my future. But again, I've learned a lot over the years, right? When I was in my early 20s starting a startup, I didn't know, my ass from my elbow. So I hired a bunch of my friends, right? And a lot of my friends surprisingly looked a lot like me, right? Nowadays, when I'm building sustainable companies that are designed for growth, I know that the number one principle that's going to really help is clarity of vision. Number two, alignment towards values. And number three, diversity, making sure that I don't just have people that come from different walks and talks of life, different backgrounds, but also diversity in all the senses of the way that that comes down. So I think that I've woken up to a lot of the errors in my judgment and the errors in my ways over the past 20 years. And I think my goal now is to spend the next 20 years just getting better every single day, being a better listener, being more clear in my thinking, and understanding how to control and tame some of the unnecessary chaos while still leaving some room for that play. And making sure that I'm not blindly trusting and making those mistakes that I made when I was a much younger, much less wise man.
I love that. And I just actually want to bring it down to this. So you probably notice I like summarizing things into short sentences, but it depends what you're looking at. It depends whether you're looking at short term or long term. So if we're talking about short-term growth for an exit in 24 months, you're going to apply a very different work ethic to it than if you are thinking much longer term. And you actually might get to the same place if you were to apply things over the longer term, because after 24 months, everyone might be burnt out and then they have to take a step back and then things slow down a lot and then you have to ramp up again, versus signing up for a more sustainable long-term journey.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think it doesn't need to necessarily be that if you are working in a sustainable way, it's necessarily slower. It just might take a longer period of time. But
Yeah.
as you say, if you neglect self-care, there will be consequences for sure.
Yeah. And I've lived that. I mean, I had a massive mental breakdown in my early 30s because I wasn't taking good care of myself. I had large falling outs with people that were my best friends, that coincidentally were working with me in some of my companies that I had over the years. I think that it's really easy to get drunk on vision sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can sort of, they say like, drinking the Kool-Aid or getting high off your own supply. Like there's a bunch of these like curt jokes that are out there, and they're jokes and cliches for a reason, right? Because in a lot of ways, there's a lot of truth in them. And if you asked me if I would go back and do it differently, I would, but there's some things I wouldn't change. So I think ultimately hindsight's 2020. People like to kind of jump on the top of the mountain and tell people what they did and would do differently. But I think everyone's journey is 100% their journey. And the more that I think we can, that's why I try to share advice on things that worked for me, right? Like this is what worked for me. Like I am no expert. Like I try to stay, informed and well-read, but this is what worked. This is what didn't work. Versus just trying to kind of like read the next fad diet on leadership or the next fad diet on how to build companies and that sort of thing. So yeah, no, I love this conversation and I appreciate it. It's helped me reflect on how much I feel like I've grown over the past 20 years. I was just imagining what it might have looked like to work for myself when I was in my early 20s, and work with myself rather. And I was like, wow, like I was a train wreck back then.
Yeah, so I can't say I would have liked to work for me in 2015 if I was the boss of me. But, you know, this is it. You live and learn, and leadership, another thing that comes up quite often that people say, it's about constantly learning, it's about growth mindset. And the more evolved leaders realize more and more as they get older, the older I get, the less I feel like I know, because they've been
Yeah.
exposed to more.
No, I think at the end of the day, we know nothing, and we're just stardust, you know, flying through the universe.
I wish I was. That sounds quite fun. So Pete, final thought here. If you could go back in time and give one piece of advice to your 20-year-old self, what would that be?
You are not your work.
That's a big one.
Yeah. And just to explain it for the audience, what I mean by that specifically is I attached my identity as a successful startup founder and a successful business owner to everything that defined who I was and how I showed up. And I think when I spent a lot of money on leadership coaching and therapy and a bunch of other stuff, what I realized was there was a deep-seated fear of failure that was scared into me at a young age. And instead of chasing my dreams, I was running from failure. And there's a very, very different difference there. You're still moving fast. You're still running, right? But are you running towards something or away from something? And I think that the way you play, the way you show up, the relationships that you build, are completely different. Nowadays, I attract and manifest the future that I see in my mind's eye, and I'm going towards that. And that means I'm focused on deep relationships with people that are not transactional. And I focus on thinking of the bigger and the smaller picture and the consequences, better and worse, that come from it, second order effects, if you will, as some people say, versus early in my career. Running from failure had me thinking very transactionally. Everything was very agenda focused. It was all about growth. It was all about innovation. It was all about the next accolade, the next mountain. And just to sort of make a corny 80s metaphor, because I'm an 80s baby, it's kind of like playing Mario and you get to the castle and you beat Bowser and it's like, sorry, Mario, the princess is in our castle, and you're chasing the next thing. That's no way to live and run a business. And that's who I was for a really long time. And now I know that my identity is so much more than my successes and my failures in work. I know that my character is not defined in my moments of success. My character is defined, and our character is defined in our moments of failure, in our moments of weakness, and how we show up and how we bounce back. Because inevitably, no matter what you do, we all fall down. We all make mistakes. And I think that you can't grow without failure and struggle. And now I focus on productive struggle. And as a husband, as a father, as a leader and community builder, I focus on those things. I try to curate those relationships. And what's ironic and fun is the caliber and the quality of people that I attract now, so much more meaningful, so much higher frequency than the caliber of people that I had around me and that I was attracting in my early 20s when I was running from failure and trying to escape this, predetermined outcome that I thought was going to be my future. So a little bit probably philosophical on a Monday, but hopefully that touches you in the audience in a bit.
I love going deep, but I'm going to summarize that into you're either coming from fear or you're coming from love.
Love it.
And if you're coming from fear, the outcomes and how you feel are going to be completely different than if you're coming from love.
Absolutely. Well said. It's I thought ChatGPT was good at summarizing. You're giving it a run for its money.
No, I think it is one of my superpowers. But
It's definitely a superpower. I'm looking forward to staying connected.
yeah, me too. Thank you so much for this conversation today, Pete. I've really enjoyed it.
Likewise, me as well.
Awesome. And to my listeners, I hope that you've enjoyed this conversation as well. If you would like to take part in the Leading in the Modern Way video interview series, please do reach out to me. Thanks. Bye for now.